I am Carla Millett, and I am Director of the Center for European Studies. And it's my great pleasure to begin by acknowledging the departments and centers that have collaborated in bringing our speaker, Robert Crawford, to campus today. The Center for European Studies, the Departments of English, History, and Comparative Literature, Contexts for Classics, the Global Scholars Program, Helen Zell Writers Program, and the Weiser Center for Emerging Democracies. It's an impressive list, right? That long list of sponsors should give you a sense of just how wide-ranging and how broadly engaged Robert's work is, and how enthusiastic the response was when we proposed his visit to campus this fall. It gives me even greater pleasure to thank a couple of people who have been immensely helpful in bringing Robert here and coordinating his visit. Zana Kweiser, our program coordinator at CES, who has worked tirelessly and thoughtlessly on his itinerary, which is a complicated itinerary, I will let you know, and Kali Israel, who first proposed that we bring Robert here to talk about the Scottish Independence Referendum, whose music we were just listening to, by the way. And who's been very, very helpful all throughout the planning and throughout the whole process. Robert's talk also is the second of 3 talks that he's going to be giving on campus. The third will take place tomorrow afternoon. It's called From Simonides to Body Bags, Poetry, the Classics, and the Contemporary. And it'll happen in Space 2435 in North Quad at 4 p.m. tomorrow. Robert Crawford, Wardlaw Professor of English at St. Andrews University, is a poet and a literary historian who has published 7 collections of poetry and over 24 other books. I'll mention only a couple of the most prominent of these. Scotland's Books is an encyclopedic, exuberant, and omnivorous review of 15 centuries of Scottish literature. It appeared in 2009. On Glasgow and Edinburgh, which was published just last year, is a bracing assessment of the standoff between those 2 cities, their distinct hold on the hearts and minds of their citizens. Imagine kind of transposing the map of Scotland onto the map of California. Imagine a book called On San Francisco and Los Angeles to get a sense of his accomplishment in this volume. Robert has also written a biography of the Scottish poet Robert Burns, which was published in 2010. And the first volume of his 2-volume biography of T.S. Eliot, Young Eliot, will appear in early 2015. And that's what we heard about last night in the English department. Now, Robert's going to talk to us today about the Scottish Independence Referendum, which took place on September 18th. The votes have been cast and tallied, and no won. Scotland remains part of the United Kingdom. But the repercussions of the Scottish challenge have been felt and continue to be felt in places like Catalonia, the Basque Country, Valencia, Corsica, Sardinia, the Veneto, Belgium, Austria, and Serbia. Devolution and regional autonomy are in the air. Scotland looks a bit like the proverbial canary in the coal mine. And the Scottish referendum truly is, as Robert called it in a poem in his recent collection, a neverendum. In celebration of both the particularity and the universality of the Scottish referendum of September 18th, I'd like to read a brief poem from Robert's most recent collection. The collection is called Testament, and it appeared just this past summer. The poem opens the section of the book called A Little History, and it's called Declaration. And it gives me great pleasure to read it in my 100% Midwestern American accent. It's going to be a way that he's never heard it read before. My name is Scotland. I am an alcoholic. Sexism runs through me as through a stick of rock. For all my blotchy pinkness, I am determined to be less prim about my gene pool, more airily cosmopolitan. To love my inner Mary, my floral clock, and John Thou Shalt Knox. I can live without nuclear subs. I've built far too many warships. All I want now is my dignity back, to stand on my own unsteady feet, sobered up, but not too sober, to renew my old alliance with this tipsy planet, my dependence and my independence. Please join me in welcoming Robert Crawford.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank all my hosts here at the University of Michigan, and not least Sana for her magnificent choreography of a complicated series of manoeuvres while I'm here. Neverendum. This is going to be rather a bookish talk. I am not a political scientist. I am not a historian. I am a poet and critic and biographer. But I will get to the contemporary, to the Scottish Independence Referendum, and to some thoughts on its consequences, not just for Scotland, but also for the rest of the United Kingdom. But let me start here. Qui quamdiu centum ex nobis vivi remanserent, nunquam anglorum dominio aliquatenus volumes subjugari, non enim propter gloriam divicias aut honores pugnamus, sed propter libertatem solomodo, cum nemo bonus nisi simul cum vita amitit. Those words come from a 1320, i.e. AD 1320 letter sent to the Pope in the names of the nobility of Scotland, 4 years after the Battle of Bannockburn, in which, rather against expectations and against the odds, King Robert the Bruce of Scotland has defeated a larger invading English army. Those Latin words are still quite often quoted in Scotland and mean essentially this. For as long as but 100 of us remain alive, never will we on any condition be brought under English rule. It is in truth not for glory, nor riches, nor honours that we are fighting, but for freedom, for that alone which no honest man gives up but with life itself. Now, the Battle of Bannockburn, which happened 700 years ago, is only one of several iconic battles in Scottish history, but it is a battle that is known still and referred to in either jokingly or otherwise in political discourse. And it was from the start the most literary of battles. Just as in modern times, in the 20th century and even today, we have had and still have war artists who are embedded with the troops and record what is happening in battle. So at the Battle of Bannockburn, there were probably several poets present, but there was certainly one poet present, a man called Robert Baston, who had been sent north with the English army, and his job was to record and celebrate the English victory at Bannockburn. Things didn't go quite to script, and he was captured by the Scots and was still made to write his poem, which, like the document I quoted from at the beginning, is a Latin poem. It's unusual in medieval Latin poetry because it's an eyewitness account of a battle. But instead of being a song of triumph, this turns into really a horrors of war poem, a poem of carnage. Hic rapit, hic capit, hic territ, hic ferit, ecce dolores, vox tonat es sonat, hic ruit, hic luit, arta modo ores, which is translated in the 21st century by a modern Scottish poet as what snatching and catching, what bruising and bristling, what grief, what war horns and warnings, what windings and worrying, no relief. It's quite a long poem, so that's just a wee snatch from it. But this writing up of Bannockburn, this mythologization of Bannockburn, this recording of Bannockburn, this celebrating of Bannockburn, this throwing up of hands in horror at Bannockburn goes on throughout the centuries. Less than 100 years after the battle is a big epic poem written by John Barber, which contains some quite famous lines. The word liking means contentment. Freedom is a noble thing. Freedom makes men to have liking. Freedom all solace to man gives. He lives at ease that freely lives. And there are a number of medieval and later medieval Scottish poems celebrating this trope of freedom. National freedom, because Bannockburn doesn't put an end to the wrangling, the sometimes bloody and bloodthirsty wrangling between Scotland and England in the Middle Ages. So the Scots go on sounding this note of freedom. Around about 1603, as you know, there's the Union of the Crowns, which means that after the death of Queen Elizabeth, there is no direct heir that the Virgin Queen has left. So she has executed Mary Queen of Scots, or not personally, but she has signed the death warrant for Mary Queen of Scots not all that long before. But the son of Mary Queen of Scots, King James VI of Scotland, takes over the English throne, becomes King James I on the throne of England. And the crowns are united, the Scottish and English crowns. And it's round about that time that Shakespeare writes Macbeth, because Shakespeare, like quite a lot of people in England, is interested. Oh, Scotland! We're going to get a Scottish king, are we? Scotland. So Shakespeare's attention, like the attention of a number of other English writers, turns to Scotland. And Macbeth, if you've read Macbeth, you will remember, portrays Scotland as a bloody mess, literally. It's a very blood-soaked play. Scotland is a place of internecine conflict, a conflict that will be resolved with the help of an invading English army. So that there is a kind of propagandistic aspect to Macbeth. Scotland can't really look after its own affairs. It needs the help of England. So it's a kind of unionist play, Macbeth. I think Shakespeare, it would be hard to read Shakespeare and decide that he was a great Scotophile. Certainly Macbeth doesn't suggest that. Elsewhere, England is presented as a sceptred isle. Except, of course, England isn't the isle, it's Britain. So there's a certain elision there, which Scottish people are perhaps not delighted about. By the time we get to the Union of Parliaments in 1707, there's a lot of republishing in Scotland of these older medieval poems celebrating Scottish independence. And that's probably a rather anxious republishing that's going on. There's worry that somehow the Union of Parliaments, the loss of the English Parliament, won't do that much damage to England, because after all, the British Parliament is still down in London. But the loss of the Parliament to Edinburgh might do quite a lot of political damage. So there's anxiety in the early 18th century about the consequences of political union with England. And that anxiety continues to some degree later in the 18th century and clearly surfaces in the work of Robert Burns. One of Robert Burns's most famous political songs begins, farewell to all our Scottish fame, farewell our ancient glory, farewell even to the Scottish name, so famed in martial story. Now Sark, these are rivers, now Sark runs o'er the Solway sands, and Tweed runs to the ocean. and mark where England's province stands. Such a parcel of rogues in a nation. And the parcel of rogues are the Scottish nobility who have sold out somehow. So that Scotland is no longer a nation in the way it was. It is now a province, England's province. That's a provocative but possibly also quite astute piece of political analysis by Burns in that song, because the challenge for Scotland after the union of parliaments is how to avoid simply being provincial, how to maintain some sense of being a nation and the things that go with being a nation, rather than being, and I apologise if there's anyone here from that part of the world, like Yorkshire. You know, Yorkshire has never been a nation. If you're from Yorkshire, you have to accept what Londoners would call provincial status. Scotland doesn't accept provincial status. Scotland always tends to remember it's been a nation. And so there's a certain stinging rebuke in that phrase in Burns's poem, Burns's song, to mark where England's province stands. He doesn't want that. He doesn't think Scottish people should accept that sense of being a province. Now, Burns's politics, Burns, of course, the national poet of Scotland, poet perhaps best known on this side of the Atlantic as the poet of Auld Lang Syne, a song sung in more Hollywood movies than any other song apart from Happy Birthday. So if you've seen When Harry Met Sally, you've heard Auld Lang Syne. If you've seen It's a Wonderful World, you've heard Auld Lang Syne. If you've lived through a few new years in this country, you've probably heard Auld Lang Syne. Even although I think for quite a lot of younger Americans, not least, they probably don't even associate it with Robert Burns or even necessarily with Scotland. Burns's politics are complicated, but one of his rather striking political statements is made in a letter to a friend where he says, "Alas, have I often said to myself, what are all the boasted advantages which my country reaps from a certain union that can counterbalance the annihilation of her independence?" So at least in one mood, Burns wants to champion the notion of Scottish independence. And Burns is interesting because in the late 18th century, he is writing with one eye on the medieval Battle of Bannockburn, but also with an eye, and you've got to realise that, of course, Robert Burns had no vote. Robert Burns came from the lower orders in society. Only about 100 people in his county of Scotland, Ayrshire, had the vote. So he wasn't living in what we would think of as a democracy today. But the American Revolution has taken place when he's 17, and then the French Revolution takes place when he's 30. And he's very alert to these sometimes violent democratic revolutions that are occurring, not in his own country, but abroad. And when he writes his poem, his song about Bannockburn, this medieval battle in 1314, yes, it's a celebration of medieval Scottish independence, but as he says to one of his friends and one of his publishers, it's also, and he's giving a kind of nudge here, about other struggles not quite so ancient. And by that he means, I think, the French Revolution. If I start singing this song, I'll empty the room, so I won't do that. But let me just remind you of it, or in some cases perhaps read it to you if you're not familiar with it. It's a song often called Scots Wha Hae. The opening words mean Scots who have, Scots Wha Hae, though its proper title goes under various titles, but is Robert Bruce's address to his troops before the Battle of Bannockburn. And like the French Revolution, and like Bannockburn, it's quite a bloodthirsty poem in some ways. Scots wha hae wi Wallace bled, Scots whom Bruce has often led, welcome to your gory bed, or to victory. Now's the day and now's the hour, see the front of battle lower, see approach proud Edward's power, chains and slavery. Wha will be a traitor knave? Wha can fill a coward's grave? Wha sae base as be a slave? Let him turn and flee. Wha for Scotland's king and law freedom's sword will strongly draw. Free man stand or free man fall, let him follow me. By oppression's woes and pains, by your sons in servile chains, we will drain our dearest veins, but they shall be free. Lay the proud usurpers low, tyrants fall in every foe, liberties in every blow, let us do or die. Now that emphasis there on freedom and on liberty, one could relate to the praise of freedom that I began with when I read you that Latin extract, or one could relate to that emphasis on freedom in medieval poems about the Battle of Bannockburn. But by the time Burns is penning this song in the 1790s, it's the era not just of liberty and freedom in that sense, it's also the era of liberté, égalité, fraternité, the era that brings us the word terrorism into the English language, because of course the terror in France is a democratic terror. It's a violent, shocking birth of a modern democracy. So it's a difficult, a traumatic time, but also a time surcharged with high ideals of liberty, equality, fraternity, brotherhood. And Burns is attuned to those. And Burns's poetry, particularly that poem, is a kind of pivotal poem between looking back to this earlier bloody medieval history, which involved the championing of freedom in Scotland, and looking forward to the possibility of a democratic future, which still in Burns's day is a dangerous hope. Democracy in Burns's Britain is a dirty word because it's associated not so much with America, that's bad enough, but with France, that's terrible. So we can see and hear that tilting away from simply medieval bloodshed towards a more modern democratic idea and ideal. And that tilt continues in Scottish writing, which is about all sorts of things, not just about Scottish independence, but nonetheless there's an important strain of writing about the idea and ideal of Scottish independence that continues beyond Burns and comes right up to the present day. A complicated strain of writing about Scottish independence, not least because, and let me put it this way, it's now, looking back from 2014, it's hundreds of years since anyone has died for the specific cause of Scottish independence. That medieval bloodshed is the last thing that we would want to return to today. So some of that legacy, although it's bound up with celebrating freedom, it's also bound up with kind of an Anglocidal mentality. You know, how is Scotland going to be free in the Middle Ages? Well, let's kill as many English people as possible. Not, I think, something that many Scots in the 19th or the 20th or the 21st or the 18th century were terribly keen on. Complicatedly and ironically, perhaps the most subtle, most nuanced, most articulated theorist of 20th century Scottish nationalism was an American. Was a very rich American who had grown up in Manhattan a man called James Dreiser, whose father was of Eastern European Jewish background, was a New York jeweler, was very well off. James Dreiser's parents divorced. His mother remarried, married a Scot, and Dreiser found himself now called James H. White. He went to Cambridge University to study international law, but he dropped out, and he moved to Scotland, to St Andrews in the 1930s. He seems to have been bisexual. He probably moved to St Andrews because he'd fallen in love with a guy who was a recent St Andrews graduate, who was an art critic. And White starts a magazine in Scotland in the 1930s called The Modern Scot. And in that magazine, he publishes W.H. Auden, some parts of W.H. Auden's poem, The Orators, written while Auden was living on Clydeside in the west of Scotland, appear in The Modern Scot. He publishes some translations of Kafka, translated by Edwin and Willa Muir. He publishes a range of international writing alongside quite a lot of Scottish writing, much of it supporting Scottish independence. I think partly because of his own Jewish heritage, James White is very alert to what's happening in Germany and in Italy in the 1930s. And he makes very clear that modern Scottish nationalism must not be ethnically based, must not be a kind of blood and soil nationalism. That might have worked in the Middle Ages, but it ain't appropriate for the 20th century. He uses words like pluralism. He wants a pluralist nationalism. He doesn't want a kind of campaigning for Scottish independence that values works of art as terribly good because they're very Scottish, and other works as no, not nearly as good because they aren't Scottish. He doesn't want these kind of naive criteria for evaluating art or thought according to some narrow notion of Scottishness. So this is quite a sophisticated notion of nationalism, and a nationalism that's evolving in conscious reaction against the rise of fascism in Germany and Italy and other parts of Europe. Now, James White left St Andrews at the end of the 1930s, went to Washington, ran an art gallery. I don't think he ever returned to Scotland. He had quite a complicated life. But a number of people in his circle in St Andrews stayed on. And to telescope things a bit, his influence was still being felt in St Andrews in the 1970s when Alex Salmond was a student there. And one of the notable things about Alex Salmond's leadership of the Scottish National Party, a relatively young party in terms of British politics, it was founded in 1934. Quite a lot of writers and poets were involved in its foundation, including Hugh MacDiarmid, Scotland's greatest 20th century poet, novelist Compton Mackenzie, and several other writers. But Alex Salmond, who became the leader of the Scottish National Party, and was the leader of the Scottish National Party until very recently. So he's the person who was leading the Scottish National Party during the independence referendum last month. Is educated at St Andrews, where I teach. The ideas of White's circle are still circulating. Alex Salmond studies perhaps an unusual combination, economics and medieval history. He's in a very small specialist class in one of his honours years towards the end of his undergraduate degree, a class taught by the man who is the most famous modern biographer of Robert the Bruce. The whole module is about Scottish Wars of Independence. Bannockburn is the highlight of the module. So Alex Salmond knows his medieval history, knows all about Bannockburn, but also his nationalism is inflected by a modern pluralist ideal of what a Scottish, independent Scottish community should be like. And there's a lot of support for this among recent Scottish writers. The literary geography of Scotland has been shaped in important ways by a number of writers, all of whom have voiced support for Scottish independence. Although in 1979, when there's a referendum as to whether Scotland should get its parliament, that for complicated reasons, although there's a narrow majority vote in favour of the parliament, the majority is not sufficient to cross a threshold that has been set down by the Westminster government. So in 1979, the parliament doesn't happen in Edinburgh. There have been attempts for the last century, really, to re-establish a parliament in Edinburgh, but they've all failed. 1979, when the referendum to re-establish a parliament in Edinburgh fails, there's kind of efflorescence of writing of various kinds, but particularly in fiction and in poetry and to some extent in drama. Books with titles like Sonnets from Scotland, Liz Lochhead's play Mary Queen of Scots got her head chopped off, and then a series of works, all of them trying to keep alive this notion of the possibility of Scottish independence. In 1999, the Labour government, unionist government, Labour government of Tony Blair delivers a Scottish Parliament as a result of a referendum, and there's a vote for a Scottish Parliament. Scottish Parliament is set up in Edinburgh. A new building opens in 2004. It has 129 MSPs, members of the Scottish Parliament, in it, elected by quite a complicated mixture of first past the post and a kind of proportional representation system. But it's been set up, this complicated system, to try and ensure that no party is likely to dominate the Parliament. And surprisingly, although quite a number of people, when the Parliament is set up, think, well, that's it. That process of devolution will give the Scots what they want, and it will kill off any desire for full independence. They'll have got their Parliament back, that's fine. Surprisingly, perhaps, that's not the way things develop. And rather against the odds, the Scottish National Party, not the only party in Scotland which supports independence, but the principal party supporting independence, secures, gets into power in 2007 and secures an overall majority in the Parliament in 2011. And that's, of course, what precipitates the referendum, which was held there in September. Now, very briefly, there's also a counter-narrative that's very strong in Scottish literature after the Union of Parliaments in 1707. It's hard, it is possible, but I think it's a distortion to see Robert Burns as a great champion of Britishness rather than as someone whose sympathies seem to have lain with Scottish independence. But from the early 18th century, when a Scottish poet, James Thomson, pens the lines of the famous song, "Rule Britannia, Britannia rules the waves." That's an emphasis on Britishness. Thomson is a proud Briton. Novelist Tobias Smollett, in his 1770 novel, The Expedition of Humphrey Clinker, takes a party of Welsh people through not just Wales, but through England and through Scotland, which they find very beautiful. And that too is a celebration of Britishness, of the United Kingdom. Walter Scott, the most globally influential Scottish novelist there has ever been, and arguably the single most influential figure in the development of the novel as a genre, is a very committed, I think, British unionist in the so-called Waverley novels. His first novel, Waverley, takes a young Englishman, a bit like Smollett's fiction, takes a young Englishman up into Scotland and through various different kinds of Scotland. It's a book about, but partly with a didactic purpose, to teach English readers about what Scotland is like, and it culminates in a marriage, a union between Waverley and a lowland Scottish woman. So its conclusion emblematizes political union. The male partner in this union is the Englishman, the female partner is the Scotswoman. So it's kind of politically loaded, but it's clearly a unionist fiction. And that championing of unionism in Scottish literature is very strong in the 19th century and continues into the 20th century in the fiction of John Buchan. Don't know if you've ever seen the Hitchcock movie, The 39 Steps, for instance. That's based on a novel by John Buchan. It's rather a good movie. Buchan, again, takes, in his case, someone who's been out in southern Africa, but nonetheless, a protagonist who, as the novel opens, begins from London and then ends up going up into Scotland and travelling around Scotland. It's a kind of adventure story written by this novelist who wrote quite a lot of fictions about Scotland and about the rest of Britain and ended up becoming Governor General of Canada. So he's like so many Scots, he's a committed British imperialist. But really, that I think is that Buchan represents the tail end of this championing of Britishness in Scottish writing. And it is a championing of Britishness in Scottish writing. It is not something, and this is a very telling point, that happens in English fiction at all. That's not to say that there aren't Scotophile writers in the literary tradition of England. If you think of Keats, if you think of Wordsworth, they are massively Scotophile, partly because they're fans of Burns. They come to Scotland, Coleridge too. They go on tours of Scotland. They write poems about Scottish sites. But think of English fiction. There are no major English novels set in Scotland, with one exception. That exception is Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse, which almost no one thinks of as a Scottish novel, but it is set in Scotland, but it's a Scotland that's really doing duty for the southwest of England, which Virginia Woolf knew far better. And it's not, I think, predominantly at all a novel about Britishness. Britishness is not a topic that interests the great English novelists. Where is Britishness in Dickens or in George Eliot or in Thackeray? It's not there. They're English novelists. They write about England. That's what matters to them. It's the Scottish novelists who tend to champion this notion of Britishness right up to round about World War II. And then that fades, that strain, which is never really there in English fiction, fades away from Scottish fiction. And that tells you a lot, I think, about notions of British identity and who they matter to. Because ironically, they often matter more to Scottish people than they do to people from England, who often tend to vaguely equate England with Britain, in the way that Shakespeare, I think, often did. And that has political consequences too. So now we've had a vote on the 18th of September, and I'm sure you know how that vote resulted. It resulted in no, 55%, yes for independence, 45%. It's probably a kind of Freudian slip that I made these lines equal, but I shouldn't have made them equal. It's quite a narrow victory. A 6% swing would have produced a different result, but that didn't happen. So, 55-45. An astonishing level of democratic engagement. 97% voter registration. Now, you think of communities in America and attempts to register voters, especially in poor communities. When is 97% voter registration achieved? The turnout, the people who actually turn out to vote, is 85% of those eligible. This is an astonishingly high turnout by standards across the Western world. It's far higher than the turnout at any recent British election or at elections to the Scottish Parliament. So there's a huge level of democratic engagement in this argument. There is some vicious comment on the internet. There are instances of trolling on the internet. A politician has some eggs thrown at him, and some of them hit him, but that's the worst thing that happens. So this is a pretty, for such a fundamental argument about the future of a society, or if you want to put it in even more loaded terms, a freedom struggle, this is very, in many ways, very measured, very civilized debate. No one's injured, no one's killed, but this is the result. No one thought 2 years ago it was going to be as close as that. When David Cameron and Alex Salmond signed the so-called Edinburgh Agreement roughly 2 years ago, which set in place the motion towards a referendum, I think David Cameron was very relaxed because he never expected there was any chance the Scots would be daft enough to vote for independence. But then there's a huge yes campaign. A cultural campaign, an artistic campaign, as well as a political campaign. So in the summer, for instance, like a lot of other writers, I was taking part in Yestival events. There was a bus party. People went round Scotland reading poems and doing all sorts of other arty things that shouldn't really mix with politics, but did. And did rather effectively, I think, and maybe not quite effectively enough, but rather effectively nonetheless. And so as it got nearer and nearer to the 18th of September, almost at the last minute, politicians in Westminster started to panic because it looked as if, and there were opinion polls appeared suggesting that there was a narrow yes majority. This had never been expected. So at the last minute, suddenly, David Cameron cancels Prime Minister's question time, moves all his political troops up to Scotland, goes on the stump. Do you have that expression, on the stump? Yeah, goes on the stump. The Labour Party, because this is peculiar political configuration, it's as if the Democrats and the Republicans decide to campaign on a joint platform. The Labour Party and the Conservative Party are campaigning on a joint platform to save the Union, keep the United Kingdom together. Arrayed against them are a motley crew of the Scottish National Party, the Greens, the Scottish Socialist Party, and some independents in the Scottish Parliament. And so lots and literally busloads of English Labour MPs are sent up onto the streets of Scotland to say, no, don't vote for independence. Kind of panic measures, really. And just a few days before the vote, the leaders of the Labour Party, British Labour Party, British Conservative Party, the British Liberal Democrat Party, because the Westminster government just now is a Tory, a Conservative Lib Dem alliance, a coalition government. They publish in the front of a tabloid newspaper what they call a vow, and they promise that voting no will not be a vote for the status quo. It will bring change. There will be more powers delivered to Scotland. The phrase that was often used, the word that was often used is devo max, meaning maximum devolution. And thank goodness, having promised that, it's okay. The UK is saved. But now, and I really do mean now, they have to deliver on this vow. But no one knows quite what was promised. What was Devo Max? Well, the Labour Party thinks it means perhaps 15% more tax-raising powers for the Holyrood Parliament. But parts of the Conservative Party think it means hand over all tax-raising powers to the Conservative Parliament and let's have a reconfiguration of Westminster as well at the same time, so that England feels it's getting something too. These are two very, very different notions of what Devo Max might mean. And Alex Salmond, who, having lost the referendum, as he was the best known figure on the yes, he's resigned. But there are still repercussions coming out of all this, including quite complicated repercussions. So when I was flying out here on Saturday, I bought a newspaper at Edinburgh Airport, the Scotsman newspaper. And not absolutely shockingly, but nonetheless rather surprisingly, the headline is Joanne Lamont quits as Scots Labour leader. Now, why on earth should she resign? She was on the winning side. Joanne Lamont resigns as Scots Labour leader, so she was the leader of the Labour Party in the Scottish Parliament, and resigns with a parting shot at Ed Miliband, who is the leader of Labour at Westminster. Why on earth is she doing that? Well, it's because, you see, if you're in the Labour Party at Westminster, your enemy, if you like, is the Conservative Party. But if you're in the Labour Party in Scotland, where there is only one Conservative MP for the whole country, so the joke, which you've probably heard so many times you're fed up with it, is that there are more giant pandas in Scotland than there are Conservative MPs. If you are leading the Labour Party at the Holyrood Parliament in Edinburgh, you don't have to worry about the Conservatives in Scotland. Your enemy is the nationalists. And how do you combat the nationalists? Well, what you mustn't seem to be is a puppet of the Labour leadership at Westminster. Because then they'll just taunt you and say you've got no independence. You're just a slave to Westminster politics. And Joanne Lamont was finding herself being more and more squeezed between the Labour Party at Westminster, which wishes to maintain centralised control over British Labour, and the very powerful, dominant, governing party in the Scottish Parliament, the SNP. And she was quite clearly wanting to make some moves in order to combat the SNP, which she was being told from London by Ed Miliband, the leader of the Labour Party, no, you can't do that. So she's in a difficult position. What's her way out? She's also been criticised from her own side for almost presiding over losing this vote, surprisingly. Because in certain working class strongholds of Labour in Scotland, most notably the cities of Glasgow on the west coast and Dundee on the east coast, the Labour vote collapsed. And although the Labour Party were going round knocking on doors saying vote no, saying no thanks, this is what we want you to do, there was a yes vote in those cities. So she's in a difficult position. She's gone. Who is the new leader of Scottish Labour? I don't know. Perhaps that's just because I've not been keeping up while I've been here. And what will the consequences be for the United Kingdom? It's been preserved for the moment at least, because this isn't an issue that's going to go away in Scotland. This vote is too close for people to be able to say, oh, that's it, absolutely sorted, we need never talk about this again. This is something that's been rumbling for hundreds of years in some ways, and rumbling quite loudly for the last several decades. It's not suddenly going to vanish. But if the Westminster government is going to be held to its vow, whatever that vow means, of giving some more powers to the Scottish Parliament in Edinburgh, well, why should the Scots get everything? And by the way, why does England have no Parliament? Because England has no Parliament. There is a Parliament in Edinburgh for Scotland, in Belfast for Northern Ireland, in Cardiff for Wales, but in London there is the British Parliament, which is not the same as an English Parliament. So why shouldn't the English have devolution? This, in a sense, is the mistake that was made from the point of view of the UK government when devolution was originally introduced. It was thought to be something for these fringe groups, you see, within the UK. It wasn't thought to be anything that anybody in England would need. Why? Because England dominates the British Parliament. But from the point of view of Scotland or Ireland or Wales, that's the problem with the British Parliament. That's why we wanted our parliaments. But now it's got more complicated. People in England think, well, some people in England are very vehemently in favour of having an English Parliament. And that surely sounds fair. The historian Linda Colley, whose work some of you may know, published a little book in which, slightly quixotically, but idealistically, she suggested there should be an English Parliament in York. Why not? Why not? Then you have the British Parliament dealing with pan-British affairs, and you have parliaments in each of the constituent nations of the United Kingdom. That's expensive, though. Do we want another layer of bureaucracy in England? Couldn't we have a cheaper solution? Yes, we could. So David Cameron and his henchfolk in Westminster have this policy now called English votes for English laws. So instead of setting up a separate English Parliament, you just have some of the sessions of the Westminster Parliament, the British Parliament, considering only English issues. And only English MPs will be allowed to vote on these issues. That sounds very fair. It really worries the British Labour Party. British Labour Party depends on a lot of Scottish MPs because Scotland still elects a lot of Labour MPs to the Westminster Parliament. If Ed Miliband, the leader of British Labour, is to oust David Cameron as Prime Minister and a Labour government is to be returned, that Labour government is likely to depend on strong Scottish support. But Scottish support for Labour is eroding. It's been eroded by the SNP. So that's difficult. What would happen if these Scottish Labour MPs couldn't vote on matters that were principally English matters? Well, that might mean that even if there were a majority Labour government at Westminster, a lot of its MPs couldn't vote on the biggest issues, which after all will relate to the biggest number of people in the UK, the population of England. So you could have a situation where there's a Labour government in power, but every time there's an English issue comes up, if you have English votes for English laws, there's a Conservative for England. So you have a big tussle going on within the Westminster Parliament. That's going to be difficult. And another danger of English votes for English laws is that if you're in Edinburgh, or you're in Cardiff, or you're in Belfast, it will make the British Parliament look all the more English. Because half its time it's just being an English Parliament. So that is likely to exacerbate pressure, in Scotland in particular, for independence again. So you have another referendum. And of course, we're about to have another referendum, but not on Scottish independence this time, on whether the UK remains part of the European Union. Because in England, the unexpected political battle is not with Scottish nationalists, it's with this party called UKIP, the UK, United Kingdom Independence Party, which thinks Britain should pull out of Europe. The EC is full of foreigners, much better, English-speaking country. We all stay together, but let's distance ourselves from things like, we've already distanced ourselves from the euro. Let's distance ourselves from all sorts of Brussels bureaucracy. Brussels, headquarters of the European Union. Brussels bureaucracy. And what's just, if you read the Wall Street Journal today, you'll see a story that's been building, which is that with a wonderful sense of timing, the European Union has just sort of phoned up David Cameron and said, by the way, we'd like another 1.7 billion, I think it's pounds, maybe euros, from you, because we've redone the calculations about how much money you have to pay to the EU this year, and you're 1.7 billion short, pal. And could we have it by the 1st of December, please? Now, Cameron's problem in England is he's battling UKIP. UKIP, a right-of-centre party, is taking support from that other right-of-centre party, the Conservative Party. And there's always been quite a strong wing in the Conservative Party of what are called Eurosceptics. People who never really liked being in bed with the French, let alone the Germans and the Belgians and all these other. And now there are lots. It's people from Poland and the Czech Republic and Slovakia. The European Union's got bigger and bigger and bigger. And can't we just have an independent United Kingdom? Cameron's public position is he thinks it's better for Britain to remain in Europe, and there's a very compelling economic case for that. But he has as other Conservative leaders, going right back to Margaret Thatcher's time, have had to deal with, he has a problem in his own party, because there are quite a lot of people in his own party that would really be quite happy for Britain to come out of Europe. These Eurosceptics within the Conservative Party, one or two of whom recently have defected to UKIP. And the UKIP vote, at present at least, seems to be very much on the rise. So how does Cameron handle that? Well, it's not helped if his official position is I want to keep Britain in Europe. It's harder to get votes for that when the European Union's knocking on the door saying, come on, Brits, give us another 1.7 billion. So he's in quite a difficult place for political manoeuvring. And in the meantime, he's not solved all this Scottish nonsense, And the clock is ticking. The clock is ticking not just because the European referendum is getting nearer, but a British general election is getting nearer. Cameron has promised that if he wins the general election in 2015, he will hold a referendum on withdrawal from Europe in 2016. But before the general election is held, probably in the spring of 2015, he has to deliver on this vow he's made to Scotland about further devolution. Because if that vow is not fulfilled by the time of the next British general election, the whole political landscape might have changed. And people like me will be saying, hey, what about that vow? All you guys voted no, and look, you got nothing for it. Come on, let's have another referendum on Scottish independence, and this time we'll get that extra 6%. So that's a problem for the British Prime Minister. And so the British Prime Minister has introduced this rather hasty-looking timetable for major constitutional change in the UK. Part of the promise was, the vow that was made to the Scottish people, right, you vote no, we've published this timetable, we will have draft legislation ready for St Andrew's Day, 30th of November 2014, and it will all be going through the works by Burns Night, 25th of January 2015, and so it will be on the statute books by the time of the next British general election. So we will have delivered on our vow. That's quite a big ask. That's moving quite quickly for substantial constitutional change. Especially if, as Cameron wants, that constitutional change is not just going to affect Scotland, but is going to affect England as well. So there may be devolution for England, which might mean regional assemblies within England. Cameron isn't keen on an English parliament, so he said, no, we'll not have a separate English parliament, we'll have English votes for English laws. So to put it crudely, there might be some days when the British Parliament just meets to decide on English stuff, and other days when it meets to decide on UK-wide stuff. That may be a rather volatile combination. It's also hard to decide what English-only issues are. Imagine suddenly there were a split in the United States. So there were Michigan issues and there were United States issues, okay? So you could vote on Michigan issues, but you couldn't vote on issues that related to the rest of the United States. Only people in the rest of the United States could vote on those. Well, some of those issues might be so big that they would have huge knock-on consequences for Michigan, willy-nilly. Wouldn't you feel a bit excluded if you couldn't vote on those? Scotland might feel that those apparently English laws and England-only issues will indirectly have big knock-on consequences for Scotland, and yet we're not allowed to vote on them. So the fact that these two countries, Scotland and England, roughly England's population is 10 times the size of Scotland's population, that inequality in terms of population size complicates the apparently fair-sounding notion of English votes for English laws, because there may be laws that really just relate to England and yet will have knock-on effects for Scotland. So we're in a very fluid situation now in terms of British constitutional politics. And we're in a fluid situation which needs, because there's a gun at Cameron's head, or if you like, the clock is ticking between now and the next UK general election, needs all to be sorted in a matter of a few months. So this is a surprisingly volatile situation to be in after apparently a clear and decisive no vote. And it may be that although evil people like me have lost the war, we may nonetheless win the peace. It's not quite clear what will emerge from this fluid situation as yet. And politicians, being politicians, go on using certain phrases, but speaking them with forked tongue. So if someone from the Labour Party says Devo Max, and someone from the Conservative Party says Devo Max, those two, they may use the same word, but they mean completely different things. Until we see quite clearly a definition of what Devo Max or increased devolution or whatever it may mean, what precisely constitutes that, we're still going to be in this strange, rather misty landscape, which is Scottish politics at present, but is also United Kingdom politics at present. Okay, I think I've spoken for long enough. So, as I say, I am not a political analyst, but if you've got some questions or comments, I would really welcome those.
Where does the fact that Scottish law is Napoleonic fit into English laws for English?
Well, England has a separate legal system at present, and there's no suggestion that it wouldn't go on doing that. Though that's complicated because the European Court can pronounce is a court of last resort, if you like, making certain pronouncements, and that's sometimes resented by people who have, if you like, UKIP sympathies. Scotland has a different legal system. Scotland has a different educational system. Scotland traditionally has a different ecclesiastical system. So those differences will continue. And I don't think there's a suggestion the English legal system will change unless its power is seen as being eroded by Brussels, which is the way some people read the runes. There's strong voices in England saying that we should withdraw from the European Convention on Human Rights. That's not necessarily because people in England suddenly want to jail everybody that disagrees with them, but it is because there's a resentment, you see, of not having control over certain kinds of decisions in the UK, but having to sign up to something that is European. Now, this may be wrong, I might be misremembering this. I think it was Belarus was the only other country that wasn't a signatory to this European Convention of Human Rights. There was one other country. So if Britain were to withdraw from the European Convention on Human Rights, one of the consequences of that might be that if, for instance, an atrocity was committed abroad by British soldiers, that would then come entirely under British law rather than under the European Convention of Human Rights. So there could be a dark side to withdrawing from that convention, but withdrawing from such a convention might also play well to people in British politics and the UKIP side of British politics that say, no, we've given away far too much to Europe already, let's repatriate some of these powers.
Thank you very much. You very brightly enumerated the different social, historical, cultural, political considerations for Scotland to have a vote for yes, which are overwhelming. But the vote was no. And the reason for that may be economic considerations?
Yes, I think so, yeah. The weakness of my general case, as I put it, is economic. It's clearly going to be a huge risk voting yes for independence. And probably the people with most to lose are people like me, reasonably successful middle-class professionals. If you were in a poor inner-city area in one of Scotland's big cities, you didn't have a lot to lose voting for independence. But if you were a merchant banker in Edinburgh, you had to think pretty carefully about that. And on balance, it might be much safer to vote no thanks. Most people who voted yes understood quite well the reasons for voting no, and vice versa. Very common to hear no voters saying, oh, my heart says I should vote yes, but my head tells me no. Perhaps a translation of that could in some cases be my heart says vote yes, but my wallet says vote no. What currency were we going to use if we became an independent country? That was something repeatedly asked by the British government because David Cameron and George Osborne were making very clear we won't have a fiscal union with an independent Scotland. So we won't share the pound with you in a fiscal union. On the yes side, they would say the pound is a joint asset which we have built up together. It's part of our shared history. We should be able, even although we go separate ways politically, to continue to share certain assets, and one of those we'd like to be the pound. Wasn't going to happen, said George Osborne. So what currency are you going to use? The yes side's preferred option was we will go on sharing the pound, even if we don't have a fiscal union. So you want to be like Panama, do you? Now, I may risk offending anybody from Panama in the audience, but when people in Scotland heard that, Scotland might be like Panama, I'm not quite sure what that means. Do we want to be like Panama? Not sure about that. Safer to vote no. Do you want to have your own currency? An option. Well, there's only 5 million of us. In a globalized world, is that going to be a bit shaky? Safer to vote no. So there are quite strong economic arguments for voting no. Perhaps 15 years ago, maybe even 10 years ago, the argument would have said, vote yes and we'll join the euro. Scotland traditionally more Europhile than many sectors of England. But that no longer seems a very safe bet, and that would probably have frightened the electorate quite a lot. The Eurozone is still a bit shaky. Does Scotland want to join the euro and be locked into certain requirements of joining the euro? Or would it be safer to stick with the pound? So the yes sides said there are several options, but our preferred option is to stick with the pound. So the Chancellor of the Exchequer, George Osborne, and David Cameron just kept saying, well, you can't share the pound in a fiscal union. And things get ruthless at this stage. So Alex Salmond went on maintaining that when the chips were down, the rest of the UK would realise that it was going to be in the UK's interests and in the interests of financial stability not to set up all kinds of complex exchange controls between one part of the island of Britain and another part, which would have piled costs onto not just Scottish businesses but English businesses, and so it would make more financial sense to go on sharing the pound between both parts of the island, even if it meant that Scotland had to cede quite a lot of financial control to the Bank of England. That was his preferred option, but it didn't convince all the electorate. So what I was going to say, interesting point was that in order to content the international financial markets, the British Chancellor had already said, even if an independent Scotland defaults on its share of UK debt, we, the UK Treasury, what would have been the surviving UK Treasury, we will be good for the whole of the UK debt. Interesting thing to say. It gave the yes side the option of saying, and this is what they did say, we would like to do the decent thing. We would like to shoulder our share of the UK national debt if there's an independent Scotland. But in return for that, for sharing, if you like, the deficit, we'd also like a fair sharing out of the assets. And one of those assets is sharing the pound as currency. And there might be other assets as well. Well, obviously the British Army, British Air Force, British Navy, they'll be divided up, so you'll get a lot of it, we'll get a bit of it. The British Library, the British Museum, you could go on and on. All these shared British institutions, not English, but British institutions. Well, if there's going to be a separate Scotland, we'll snip a bit off, say 10% of those, we'll get that. The British government's position tended to be, we're not negotiating about any of that unless there's a yes vote. But an option would have been for an independent Scotland to say, right, if you're not sharing any of these assets with us, we're not sharing the debt with you. Oil. Well, the economics of oil were much argued over. The no side, the unionist side, would tend to say, oh, there's hardly any oil left in the North Sea. It'll be catastrophic for Scotland if you're trying to rely on your oil resources. The yes side would be saying, well, there's billions of barrels of oil still to come out of the North Sea. Scotland, like Norway, oil-rich nation. It'll all be fine, folks. The truth, no doubt, somewhere in between the two of these. And someone this morning asked me a very intelligent question. Why the hell did the English want the Scots to, if the Scots are being so bolshy and difficult, why did the English want the Scots to stay in the United Kingdom?
They wanted Ireland.
Well, yes. I mean,
They were more token.
yes. And whatever has happened in Ireland, and this too was held up as a terrible warning to Scotland. Look at Ireland. It was a tiger economy, but then the financial crash came and the Irish economy went down the toilet. But even if that were the case, we haven't heard the Irish all knocking on the doors of Westminster and saying, please, can we come back and not be an independent country anymore? I think once you become an independent country, you want to stay an independent country on the whole. But the oil resources were certainly something that would have been lost to the rest of the United Kingdom and to the inhabitants of England. So that was a significant bargaining chip that Scotland would have held, and possibly one of Scotland's largest assets. So the economic arguments were quite complicated, and I'm not the best person to go into them, is the truth.
So was the Yes campaign essentially a Europhile campaign, or was it?
Yes.
So there could have been.
Oh yes, I mean Salmon was desperate to have Scotland. Independence in 2014 does not mean the same as it meant in 1314. Nobody was pretending that. So Salmon was desperate for an independent Scotland that was a member of the European Union, a member of the European community, had a seat at the table at Brussels. A small seat, a stool if you like, but nonetheless a seat there, yeah. Now, having lost the referendum, we could find ourselves taken out of Europe on the coattails of a vote in England, a Eurosceptic vote in England. That would be quite difficult. I don't think there are many yes voters who were Eurosceptics, but there are a lot of Eurosceptics south of the border.
Accepted, there seemed to be very little from the English and the Scottish, but then I was thinking of Stella. And also, in other words, certainly there were English who were going and claiming, or being in Scotland seemed to be important. Queen Victoria
Yes.
So what were they doing?
Yes. But Queen Victoria is hardly one of England's great novelists. Queen Victoria, like the present British monarchy, has a great love of Balmoral. Scotland's somewhere you go for your holidays.
So there was no more investment in it?
Yes, there's a clear historical investment in the whole history of the United Kingdom. David Cameron got into terrible trouble in Britain with the Queen because, what was it, to the mayor of New York? He said something that was picked up by a journalist. He didn't realise this would be overheard, and he said something about the Queen was purring down the phone after the independence result. The Queen had been very careful to appear neutral. The Scottish government, the Scottish National Party government in Edinburgh had said they would keep the Queen as the head of state. There's probably quite a lot of Republicans in the Scottish National Party, but it wouldn't have been a vote winner to say we'll dump the monarchy. The monarchy generally is too well loved across Scotland as well as across England. So their official position was the Queen will remain the head of state, and the Queen's official position was that she was neutral, she wasn't going to comment on the issue. So when Cameron, with that rather indiscreet comment, seemed to be politicising the monarchy in this debate, that was naughty of him. He shouldn't have done that. But the Queen does not spend a lot of time in Scotland, does not spend a lot of time at Balmoral. I'm being unfair and caricaturing perhaps, but one could say that Scotland was to some extent a kind of royal playground.
What about St. Andrews being an education?
We are proud to educate a wide variety of students and try and give them all equal treatment in terms of education. So yes, Prince William was a student at St Andrews, Kate Middleton was a student at St Andrews, but as I mentioned, Alex Salmond, the leader of the Scottish National Party, who grew up in a council house, social housing as you would say, in central Scotland, was also a student at St Andrews. And I think that's something the university can be proud of. I am allowed to express my own political views, but I'm not expressing political views on behalf of my institution. And that was a good thing too in terms of debate. My university principal, who's an Irish woman who spent most of her academic career at Harvard, made clear, as did a number of other Scottish university principals, that officially at least she was going to be neutral in this debate. But she wanted academics and others in the university to speak out whichever side of the debate they were on. Now, that meant that I think the truth is, in some earlier generations, to be an academic at a Scottish university and to be very publicly, vocally in support of Scottish independence would have got you into a bit of trouble with the university authorities. But that hasn't happened of late. Possibly we'll take one more question. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you for the marvelous lecture. I'm looking ahead to the future since you were saying it's such a close vote last month, which it was. Was there, in the voting process, college students in this high turnout, looking down the road, were they overwhelmingly in favor of one side or the other?
Not overwhelmingly, but by and large, the demographics, if things were to continue along the same pattern, the demographics would in the longer term favour the yes side. Generally speaking, older people tended to vote no, and younger people tended to vote yes. Slightly more complicated than that, but I think, to put it very crudely, the more you remembered, say, about World War II, the more you were likely to vote no. You know, for some people, some people now, my mother's in her 90s. The defining event of the lives of that generation was the Second World War. Was the magnificent Churchillian rhetoric of Britishness. Why would you give that up? He was an empire man. He was an empire man. He was he was an empire man. Yes. But he made possible the defeat of fascism, which was a magnificent achievement. Not single-handedly, but nonetheless, he was such a powerful, rhetorical, and magnificent voice in the defeat of Hitler. Now, I'm not saying that younger generations of Scots are Nazis or anything like that. I'm just saying that they are further removed from that high point of Britishness in the 20th century. 16-year-olds could vote in this election. Yeah, wow. The voting age for general elections in Britain is 18. But the threshold was lowered. It was probably a political calculation on the part of the Scottish government. They thought they would get more votes this way. Didn't necessarily work quite as simply as that, but nonetheless, 16 and above were allowed to vote. And there was an astonishing level of engagement in schools, in high schools. You know, some of these, my daughter to start with, for instance, thought this was wrong, shouldn't be, no, we don't know enough. But I don't think she felt that by the time the vote came along. There was enormously intensive debate among high school students as to, what was right? And they were all having their own elections. Probably in the long run, that will be quite good for democratic participation. Right, let's stop at that. Thank you. Thank you.